Take the generator first, quickly, before the others get here. Somebody's already in the storeroom. Let them take the pots. I want the land papers. Where's Papa's strongbox? Ask her. She's had 40 years to hide it. 9 children descended on the compound in Kwame Boateng's village outside Kumasi, within 2 days of his burial, moving through the house he'd built with his own 2 hands. Over decades, like a swarm that had been waiting, patiently, for exactly this moment. They were not children anymore. The youngest was past 40. Most had spent decades, scattered across Accra and Kumasi, and for 2 of them, London and Frankfurt, visiting their father only when convenient, missing birthdays, missing the quiet decline of his final years, appearing now with a punctuality none of them had ever managed while he was alive. Standing in the doorway of the bedroom she had shared with him for 31 years was Adjoa, his wife, watching 9 grown adults strip the compound of furniture, appliances, and dignity in equal measure, while not one of them had thought to ask her how she was holding up. What none of the 9 knew, standing in that ransacked courtyard congratulating themselves on land they hadn't yet legally touched, and never actually would, was that their father had walked to the chief's palace 11 years earlier, and made absolutely certain none of it would ever belong to them. If stories about quiet loyalty finally getting protected against greed matter to you, subscribe to Karma Lullabies and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. The man who built slowly Kwame Boateng was not a wealthy man by the standards of Accra or Kumasi. He was a farmer and a small trader, someone who had spent close to 50 patient years acquiring land parcel by parcel around his village, cocoa fields mostly, along with a modest timber plot, and, later in his life, the actual building that had become the local church, constructed largely with his own money after the previous structure had been condemned. He was, by every honest account of people who'd known him across those decades, a serious, unshowy man, the kind who measured his worth in what he'd actually built rather than in what anyone happened to say about him. He had married quite young, and that first marriage had produced the 9 children who arrived at his compound the week he died. It had also, by the honest accounts of nearly everyone in the village who remembered those years, been a genuinely difficult marriage, marked by his first wife's long absences and, eventually, her decision to leave the village entirely when the children were mostly grown, moving to the city and remarrying without ever formally divorcing him under customary process, a complicated, painful chapter that the children themselves rarely discussed in any detail, though its shadow touched everything that came after. His 9 children grew up largely raised by extended family and by Kwame himself in the gaps, and as adults, they scattered the way ambitious children from a farming village often do, chasing opportunity in the cities, and for 2 of them abroad. The eldest, a son who'd built a moderately successful trading business in Accra, visited most consistently in the early years. Though even those visits had a transactional undertone, villagers noticed long before Kwame ever said anything about it openly, always circling back, eventually, to a request for capital or a complaint about how little their father had ever given them compared to what other village families provided their own children. 2 daughters married into families in Kumasi and settled into lives that left decreasing room for a father 2 hours away by road. A younger son cycled through a series of failed ventures, each one funded partly by a loan from Kwame that was never repaid and rarely even acknowledged as a debt in later conversations. Visits home grew rarer with each passing year. Phone calls thinned out to holidays, and eventually not even reliably then. Kwame Boateng spent the back half of his life running his farms largely alone, watching his children build lives that had less and less room in them for the man who'd made those lives possible in the first place. The woman who stayed Adjoa came into Kwame's life roughly 2 decades after his first marriage had effectively ended, working initially as help around his compound during a stretch when his health first began to falter and none of his 9 children had offered or been asked to come manage his affairs. She was younger than him by a significant margin, and the arrangement, in its earliest months, was purely practical. Someone to cook, someone to help manage the farm hands, someone to make sure an aging man living increasingly alone didn't simply fall through the cracks of his own life. It became something else over time, the way these things sometimes do, built less on romance in the beginning than on the specific, unglamorous intimacy of someone who actually shows up. Adjoa learned his farms. She learned which buyers to trust in Kumasi, and which ones tried to shortchange an aging farmer they assumed wouldn't notice. She nursed him through a stretch of serious illness in his 60s that none of his 9 biological children traveled home for, not one of them, a detail that villagers who remembered that period still mention with a specific, quiet disapproval whenever the family comes up in conversation. They married formally a few years into the arrangement, a small ceremony attended by villagers and almost none of his children, several of whom, by that point, had made their disapproval of the marriage, and of Adjoa specifically, a matter of open village gossip. The disapproval had very little to do with genuine concern for their father's happiness, and almost everything to do with land. 9 adult children, several of them struggling financially in the cities they'd moved to, watching their aging father's assets sit in the hands of a woman decades younger than him, did the arithmetic the way disappointed heirs everywhere tend to, and didn't love the answer it produced. A woman that age, married to a man that age, would likely outlive him by decades, and whatever she controlled at the moment of his death would sit indefinitely outside their reach for as long as she lived. That math, rarely spoken aloud directly, but audible in nearly every conversation about the marriage, shaped how several of the children treated Adjoa from the very beginning, less like a stepmother and more like a competitor who had gotten to the finish line first. She absorbed all of it without much complaint, in part because complaint had never been her instinct, and in part because she understood, better than any of them seemed to, exactly how precarious her position actually was, under the assumptions most of the village still carried about who land was supposed to belong to when a marriage like theirs eventually ended in death. She had watched other women in similar positions across the region lose everything the moment a husband died, watched extended families and grown children descend and simply take. Regardless of decades of loyalty, regardless of what a widow had actually built alongside the man, everyone suddenly wanted to remember fondly now that his assets were up for distribution. She never once, in all the years villagers later described, gave any sign that she expected Kwame's arrangement to protect her. She simply kept doing the work in front of her, the way she always had. What was actually happening behind the scenes for years? Kwame Boateng watched the way his children treated Adjoa on the rare occasions they did visit, the barely concealed contempt, the pointed questions about what exactly she thought she was entitled to, the visits that always seemed to circle back, eventually, to some version of a conversation about the land. He watched 2 of his sons, in particular, run through money faster than they earned it, chasing business ventures that collapsed with predictable regularity, each collapse followed by a visit home that had considerably more warmth in it than any visit that hadn't been preceded by a financial emergency. He watched several of his children conduct their own personal lives with a carelessness that occasionally spilled into open village scandal, entanglements and broken engagements that made their way back to him, regardless of the distance. Because villages talk, and Kwame Boateng, whatever else he was never a man who stopped listening. None of what he watched surprised him particularly. What it did was crystallize a decision he'd apparently been turning over for years. His land, the cocoa fields he'd spent 5 decades assembling parcel by parcel, the church building he'd personally funded, the compound Adjoa had spent years actually helping him run. None of it, he decided, was going to end up divided 9 ways among children, who mostly treated him as a periodic source of emergency funding and treated his wife as an obstacle standing between them and an inheritance they'd never lifted a finger to help build. In a village governed as much by customary land practice as by formal law, a decision that significant doesn't stay purely private, and doesn't stay purely paper either. Land in that part of Ghana carries deep customary weight, tracked and witnessed through relationships with chieftaincy structures that have functioned in parallel with the formal court system for generations. Kwame understood exactly how much weight a decision like his would need behind it to actually survive the fight he knew was coming the moment he was no longer alive to defend it himself. If you want to see exactly what Kwame Boateng did about it, 11 years before his death, stay with this one. And subscribe to Karma Lullabies so you don't miss what happens when his children finally find out. The walk to the chief's palace 11 years before he died, Kwame Boateng walked to the palace of the local chief, carrying with him a formally drafted will, prepared with the help of a lawyer in Kumasi, laying out in specific, unambiguous language exactly how his self-acquired land and property were to be distributed after his death. The overwhelming majority of it, the cocoa fields, the timber plot, and the church building he'd funded, was left entirely to Adjoa. Small, specific provisions were made for a handful of his children, modest and clearly intentional rather than oversights. But the bulk of what he'd spent a lifetime building was directed, deliberately and completely, to the woman who had actually stayed. He didn't simply file the will with a lawyer and leave it at that. He brought it to the chief specifically because he understood something his children, wrapped up in their own assumptions about entitlement, apparently never bothered to consider. In a community where land disputes are common, and where customary expectation can sometimes run directly against the explicit wishes of a deceased person's own written will, having the chief personally aware of, and able to formally attest to, his intentions while he was still alive, and of sound mind, was worth far more than a document sitting quietly in a lawyer's file cabinet in a city hours away. The chief listened to Kwame explain his reasoning in full. The chief witnessed the will, and the chief agreed to hold that knowledge quietly for however many years it took, exactly the way Kwame Boateng had asked him to. For 11 years, that knowledge sat almost entirely undisturbed. Kwame told none of his 9 children what he'd done. He told none of the village gossips who might have carried the news back to Accra and Kumasi faster than he wanted it to travel. He continued running his farms, continued absorbing his children's periodic visits and periodic requests for money, continued watching Adjoa manage the compound with the same quiet competence she'd brought to it for years, all while the single most consequential financial decision of his life sat locked away in the memory of a chief and the files of a lawyer 2 hours' drive from the village. The final years, Kwame's health declined steadily through his final years, the way it does for most people who live long enough, and Adjoa was there for every part of it, exactly as she had been from the beginning. She managed his medications. She sat with him through hospital stays that his children once again mostly heard about secondhand, and mostly didn't interrupt their own lives to attend. When he finally passed quietly at home, in the compound he'd spent 50 years building, it was Adjoa who found him, Adjoa who made the calls, and Adjoa who began the exhausting, grief-heavy work of organizing a funeral for a man whose 9 children would descend on the proceedings within days, treating the entire event less like mourning and more like a staging ground for what they'd already, privately, decided was coming to them. Funerals in that part of Ghana are significant, extended community events, often stretched across several days of formal mourning, viewing, and burial rites that draw extended family, neighbors, and church congregants from well beyond the immediate village. Kwame Boateng's drew a large crowd, genuine mourners who'd known and respected him for decades, farmers he'd done business with fairly for years, church members who remembered exactly whose money had rebuilt the sanctuary they were sitting in. all standing alongside 9 children, whose grief, several villagers would later note quietly to each other, seemed to arrive with unusual speed once the burial itself was finished, and attention turned toward the compound and everything sitting inside it. There is a particular, uncomfortable rhythm to watching genuine grief sit beside performed grief in the same room. And several people who attended the funeral described exactly that discomfort afterward. The eldest son delivered a formal tribute at the service, warm, polished, entirely appropriate for the occasion, the kind of tribute that sounds, on the surface, indistinguishable from real love. Less than 48 hours later, that same son was the one tearing through his father's bedroom, looking for a strongbox, a contrast stark enough that even neighbors who tried, out of respect, to give the family the benefit of the doubt, found it difficult to keep extending it. The stripping of the house within 2 days of the burial. The compound Kwame Boateng had spent 50 years building was being systematically stripped by his own children. Furniture, appliances, farm equipment. One of his sons went looking specifically for a strongbox he assumed held cash or land documents, tearing through drawers and cabinets with an urgency that had nothing to do with grief and everything to do with a lifetime of assumption finally coming due, in his mind, for collection. Adjoa stood largely alone through most of it, 31 years of marriage, reduced, in the span of 48 hours, to 9 adult stepchildren, treating her like an obstacle to be managed rather than a widow to be supported. Several of the children openly discussed, within her hearing, how quickly they intended to have her removed from the compound once the land was formally transferred into their names. Conversations conducted with the casual, unhurried cruelty of people who have never once considered that their assumptions might be wrong. One daughter reportedly told her, directly, that she should be grateful for whatever small amount they eventually decided to give her, that the land had always belonged to the family and would return to the family exactly the way it was always supposed to. None of them had thought to ask a lawyer. None of them had thought to ask the chief. They had simply assumed, the way people raised with a certain expectation of inheritance often do, that the outcome was inevitable and that the only remaining question was how quickly they could formalize what they already considered theirs. The chief sends for the family. Word reached the chief's palace, as word in a village like that always eventually does, that Kwame Boateng's children were dividing up his compound before the formal mourning period had even properly concluded. The chief, who had carried the knowledge of Kwame's will quietly for 11 years, sent word to the family that a formal meeting would be held at the palace, that matters concerning the late Kwame Boateng's estate would be addressed there, and that all 9 children, along with Adjoa, were expected to attend. The 9 arrived at the palace with the confident, slightly impatient energy of people expecting a formality, a ceremonial nod toward tradition before the paperwork that would confirm what they already considered inevitable. Adjoa arrived quiet, exhausted, and by every account of people present that day, entirely unsure herself what was actually about to happen, since even she hadn't been told the specifics of what Kwame had arranged all those years earlier, only that he'd once mentioned, briefly and without elaboration, having taken care of things. The chief, in the formal, unhurried manner such proceedings carry in that setting, produced the will. What the will actually said, the chief read the document in full, in the presence of the entire gathered family, exactly as Kwame Boateng had arranged 11 years earlier. The cocoa fields, parcel by parcel, left to Adjoa. The timber plot, left to Adjoa. The church building he'd personally funded, placed under a structure ensuring it would continue serving the community rather than becoming a private asset any single family member could sell off. Modest, specific provisions for a handful of the children, clearly intentional rather than an oversight, and clear, unambiguous language explaining exactly why the bulk of the estate had been directed the way it had, citing, specifically, the decades of absence, the periodic financial demands, and the sustained, documented disrespect several of the children had shown toward the woman who had actually built the compound's daily life alongside him. The reaction in the room, according to multiple people present that day, moved through disbelief, then anger, then, for at least two of the sons, something closer to genuine panic, given how much of their own recent behavior had been built on the confident assumption of an inheritance now visibly evaporating in front of them. One daughter reportedly demanded to know how a will could simply appear after 11 years without any of them ever being told, and the chief's response was simple and, by every account, delivered without a trace of satisfaction in it. Your father told you nothing, because your father knew exactly how this room would react to the truth. He waited to give you the reaction you're having right now, 11 years in advance, because he'd already watched you have it once, over money, when he was still alive to see it clearly. The legal fight that never stood a chance. Several of the children pursued the matter further, consulting lawyers of their own in Kumasi, attempting to challenge the will's validity on various grounds, arguing undue influence, arguing incapacity, arguing anything that might reopen a door the chief's formal, decade-old witnessing of the document had already closed firmly behind them. Ghanaian law, like most legal systems, generally respects a person's right to direct their own self-acquired property through a properly executed will, and Kwame Boateng's had been drafted by a lawyer, witnessed formally by a sitting chief, and left entirely undisturbed and unchallenged for 11 full years while he remained alive, competent, and, by every account, of completely sound mind the entire time. The challenges failed, one after another, exactly the way legal challenges tend to fail when they're built on assumption and grievance rather than genuine legal defect. What the 9 children were left with, after months of legal fees spent contesting a document that had never had a real vulnerability to begin with, was considerably less than what they'd have received if they'd simply accepted the will's terms from the outset, plus a public, permanent record of exactly how they'd behaved in the days immediately following their own father's burial. The strongbox one of the sons had torn the house apart searching for, incidentally, was never found in any dramatic sense, because it had never held what he assumed it did. Adjoa, when finally asked directly, explained it had simply contained old farm receipts and correspondence, the unremarkable paper trail of a working farm, not the treasure his imagination had built it into during the frantic hours he'd spent searching drawers instead of grieving. What Adjoa kept Adjoa remained on the compound, in the home she had spent 31 years helping build into something worth fighting over, now legally secured in a way that could no longer be casually stripped away by 9 adult children who had, in the space of 2 days after a burial, made unmistakably clear exactly what they had actually thought of her the entire time they'd known her. She kept the cocoa fields running, kept the church operating as the community resource Kwame had intended it to remain, and continued the quiet, unglamorous work of managing a working farm exactly as she had for decades. Except now, with the full legal weight of a will and a chief's formal witness standing behind her instead of simply her own persistence. Villagers who watched the entire saga unfold have, in the years since, largely settled into the same conclusion the chief himself seemed to reach the day he read that will aloud. Kwame Boateng hadn't punished his children out of spite. He'd simply, patiently, over 11 quiet years, made sure that the one person who'd actually shown up for the unglamorous, unrewarded work of loving him in his final decades wouldn't be left with nothing the moment he could no longer protect her himself. A handful of the children eventually, grudgingly, reconciled with Adjoa in the years that followed, arriving at something resembling an actual relationship only once the fighting had exhausted itself, and there was nothing left to gain from continued hostility. Others never did, choosing instead to treat the entire episode as a permanent grievance, retelling their own version of events to anyone who'd listen, a version that conveniently left out those 2 frantic days of stripping the compound and the comments made well within Adjoa's hearing. Adjoa herself, by most accounts, never spent much energy correcting those retellings. She had, after 11 years of watching her husband build a quiet, patient defense of her future, without ever once needing her to ask for it, apparently absorbed at least one of his core lessons completely. Some things don't need to be argued. They only need to be documented, witnessed, and allowed to stand on their own when the moment finally comes. If a story about loyalty finally being protected against greed, formally and permanently, means something to you, tell me in the comments. And if you haven't yet, subscribe to Karma Lullabies, because this is exactly the kind of quiet justice we tell every single week. The last word on the man who planned 11 years ahead, Kwame Boateng, never confronted his children directly about how he felt, watching them treat his marriage and his wife with such open, casual contempt. He never delivered a speech, never staged a dramatic confrontation, never gave them the satisfaction of a fight they could later characterize, to themselves or to the village, as unfair or impulsive. He simply walked to a chief's palace 11 quiet years before his death and made absolutely certain that when the moment finally came, the only version of the truth left standing would be the one he deliberately, patiently built, witnessed, and protected for over a decade before anyone else even knew to look for it. The 9 children who descended on that compound within 2 days of his burial, certain they already knew exactly how the story ended, learned instead that their father had been several moves ahead of them the entire time, quietly, without a single one of them ever suspecting it. They came for a house, for a strongbox, for land they'd already mentally divided among themselves before the funeral rites had even fully concluded. What they found, waiting for them, at the chief's palace, was 11 years of patience, finally arriving to collect on everything they'd assumed, incorrectly, they'd never have to answer for.